It's been forever since I've uploaded a Genshin or a Honkai Star Rail video for that matter, or really, well, any kind of long form video, and I really don't have a good excuse for this outside of, well, I just was kind of a little burnt out on making videos like this. But after going through some of my old content and rewatching some of my Genshin versus Honkai Star Rail videos and realizing that, wow, I really do suck at video editing, I decided I might as well make another one of these videos, because you can't improve something if you don't, well, do it, I guess. Now, some disclaimers before we continue. Yes, I will be discussing Genshin vs. Honkai Star Rail, specifically the content that was released in 2025, but if I were to cover every little game mechanic, every little character quest, or world quest, or God forbid, every little event that got released in the last year, I would probably go insane. So while I'm going to be covering general things, just please know that I won't be talking about every single little thing that happened in the last year. So if I happen to miss your favorite thing, congratulations. Please scream at me in the comments, because I love to hear about how I've messed up. Genuinely, I'm not even joking. Please just scream at me in the comments about it. It'll make you feel better. I'll probably feel better. Well, I mean, I might feel a little bit bad about forgetting something at first, but mostly I'll feel better afterwards, so please feel free to do it. Additionally, I will say that this is going to be mostly a story-focused analysis, so new game modes or game mechanics aren't really going to be touched on. I am going to touch on, like, free-to-play mechanics a little bit in the last section that we talk about, but that's mostly just because I'm talking about the characters themselves, and even then, I'm just going to be very general about it, and this is because, honestly, I like the game mechanics in Honkai Star Rail way more than I like them in Genshin, so if I were to cover them, I wouldn't be very objective. So, again, mostly story-focused, a little bit engagement-focused on how well the game's development teams were able to keep up engagement between patches. Other than that, story. So, with all of this being said, I'm going to be giving the winner of each category a point, and by the end of the video, the game with the most points will be crowned the victor of 2025. So, let's get into it. Now, I will talk about things that are happening in the main game. I consider main game things like Archon quests or Trailblaze missions. Also, I'm going to be covering the patches that either mostly took place in 2025 or completely took place in 2025. And for the first patches, I'm going to be talking about the first full patch of each game that took place in 2025, which for Genshin was patch 5.3, or the final part of the Nod Archon quest, and for Honkai Star Rail, that was version 4.0, or the start of Amphoreus. I'm doing this mostly just to try to keep it a little bit fair. So we're going to start with Genshin, because Genshin's content in the last year has been a bit, complicated. And Honkai Star Rail is a bit more straightforward, so let's get the complicated stuff out of the way. The Genshin developers spoke about how they would be slowing down Genshin's pace, as there was still a lot more that they needed to cover in the story, and packing everything in the way they were doing was a disservice to the story and the game. And I want to give the developers props for reevaluating that, because honestly, reevaluating things and deciding to change direction with Genshin is something that is, kind of a bold move, and I appreciate that they're open to criticism. Though, and this is more of a personal complaint, and it really has no bearing on this video since my complaints start in 2026, I don't think they've done a very good job in finding the right balance between main game content and things like world quests, which for me is fairly frustrating. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit, I don't play through the world quests because I have an ADHD goblin in my brain that has to be constantly engaged, and playing through quests where there are no voices and I'm just reading everything the entire time does not keep the goblin engaged. I know. I suck. I'm sorry. And again, these complaints are mostly in 2026 and don't really have anything to do with this video, so just disregard it. I just had to say it, otherwise again, the little goblin in my brain would start eating my brain cells, and I really can't afford to spare any. So, back to the main point. Genshin finished off the Nod Archon quest, which was one of my personal favorite Archon quests to date in the Genshin story, and I personally actually love the ending to this Archon quest specifically. Lantern Rite also took place during this patch, but we're going to be talking about events later on in the video, so putting that aside, there were two patches that were then fairly empty of main game content, and Genshin used this opportunity to drop some events and character stories along with world quests, which again, I've already stated my opinion on world quests. You have it. However, Genshin did do an amazing job of keeping engagement going in between patches by introducing to us slowly Nod Krai lore, and they did this mostly through web events and some kind of intermittent lore that was kind of sprinkled in throughout the rest of the content in the game, which was really well done. The next exciting patch, in my opinion, was Paralogism, which brought us back to Mondstadt, my favorite region. It introduced us to some new themes and concluded the long-awaited Durin and Albedo storyline. I was a big fan of this patch, not just because of the story, which, outside of being very well written narratively, also gave us some amazing lore drops and built up some locations we would be going to later, but also because, again, it brought us back to Mondstadt, one of my favorite places, and Mondstadt doesn't get enough love. Finally, we had 2 more patches, which included an interlude or prequel quest and some important events, but again, those are going to be discussed in their own category later on, so let's skip ahead of it. Now, technically, the ending to the Nod Krai Archon quests didn't release until 2026, so we won't be speaking about the ending of this Archon quest exactly. Overall, I think the Nod Krai Archon quest was solid, and I have very few, if any, complaints about the story. We were introduced to characters that we had been waiting for, like Columbina, and other harbingers like Sandrone and Dottore, and what Nod Krai did particularly well was weaving in the Traveler's lore with Nod Krai. I would argue that perhaps outside of Notlon, Nod Krai did the best when it came to making it feel like the Traveler was meant to be a Nod Krai, and like what the Traveler was doing actually kind of mattered to the story. Nod Krai also managed to tie up some loose ends to some other stories and gave us more background on certain characters like Alice and Nicole from the Hexen Circle. The only complaint I have, if you can really call it a complaint, is mostly that just while Nod Krai definitely met my expectations, I wouldn't say it like blew them out of the water by any means. Nod Krai was good and I was excited for new patches to drop, but like I wasn't like super duper excited and I didn't like talk to my friends as much about it between patches. And that's kind of why I say again, Nod Krai met my expectations, but it didn't really go above and beyond in any significant way, and I wouldn't say, with maybe the exception of the patches that have been released recently, because again, the most recent patch is really interesting, but we're in 2026 and this is about 2025, I feel like Nod Krai is probably not my favorite Archon quest. I don't know, it just really hasn't done it for me. Like, it's good, but it's just like, you know what I mean? Versus if we switch focus to Honkai Star Rail, which had the benefit of covering essentially one full version over the course of 1 year. I loved Amphoreus. I'm not going to hide it. I think it's the singularly best story that Honkai Star Rail has ever produced, and honestly, might be one of the better written stories that Hoyo has ever made overall. Now, that's not to say that there aren't complaints about the story, like the fact that the patches are incredibly long, which they definitely were, and like there being a lot of talking and exposition, which again, there definitely was, and I feel like these are reasonable complaints. I made some of the same complaints while I was playing through. But despite those complaints, I genuinely believe that Amphoreus is one of the most well-written and character-driven stories that Hoyo has put out in either game. Every time a patch ended, all I wanted to do was talk about it with my friends, and I couldn't wait for the next patch to be released. In general, in my opinion, Amphoreus struck the perfect balance between introducing new aspects of Honkai Star Rail, the universe exactly, like the Genius Society, the anti-organic equation, Noose, and the Remembrance, while staying grounded in the world we were inhabiting. Additionally, it felt like the Trailblazer and the other members of the Astral Express within Amphoreus had real roles that they needed to fulfill, and they played a really important part towards the ultimate outcome of the story. I could go on, and I probably will make a recap of Amphoreus someday, but for right now, I kind of want to move along. In general, as far as main game content goes, I do think that Honkai Star Rail blew Genshin out of the water. While the Nod Krai Archon quests did meet my expectations, as previously mentioned, it did not go above and beyond them in any real way. Whereas, for me personally, the main game content in Honkai Star Rail was strong for the entire year and consistently blew past my expectations. So, Honkai Star Rail gets the point for the first category. Now, moving on to events, Honkai Star Rail didn't have a lot of events over the last year, likely because the main story content was, really heavy, though there is one notable and glaring exception, and that is, of course, the Fate Stay Night collab. This was a highly anticipated event, and as somebody who has been in the Fate fandom for nearly a decade, I am in the unique position to be able to talk about this event. Although, I will admit, I kind of have a hot take when it comes to the Fate collab in Honkai Star Rail. The Fate collab, according to a lot of people, especially people who are in both fandoms, sucked. Hoyo reused assets from ID Silizii when we were supposed to be going back to Saber's homeland, which is, of course, Britain or England. And given that Amphoreus has Greek or Roman influences, the clash was intense, and it took even me out of the experience. There was also the whole silent film section, which I see why they did, and it did kind of make sense for Penacony, but people in the English dub were coming off the SAG-AFTRA strikes, and it just was kind of a bit tough to play through. More than that, a lot of people felt the collab characters didn't get enough screen time. Now, I think this is a bit of a weak complaint personally. The Honkai Star Rail characters are always going to take more screen time because there's more of them, and this is a Honkai Star Rail game, not a Fate game. Truthfully, I think a lot of people's negative feelings towards this collab could have been mitigated if Hoyo didn't reuse assets from Amphoreus, especially given this collab had been announced for quite some time and had a lot of hype surrounding it. Reusing assets so blatantly feels really shitty, and like Hoyo just kind of didn't care about the collab overall. Now, all of that being said, I, personally, in my personal opinion, actually really liked the Fate collab. I liked what they did with Saber's character, considering she's a character I usually dislike in most Fate franchise material, which is another hot take that a lot of people in the Fate fandom, have strong feelings about. And also, I think this is one of the few times we got more Penacony lore that was actually interesting, well written, and added something to the Penacony world overall. The themes of the story tied in well with both Fate Stay Night and Amphoreus themes. Here, I'm talking specifically about the theme of regret, or the burden that comes from being a hero, which resonated well with the characters they picked for the collab, specifically Archer and Saber, although they could have done a better job in bringing these stories forward, as you likely would have missed the connection if you weren't an avid Fate fan, but it also kind of brought forward not only themes about maybe the Trailblazer, but also specifically about Fanart, which, given where it kind of fell within the Amphoreus story, was really good, in my opinion. So in my opinion, the Fate collab was about what I expected, and I was able to overlook the reuse of assets, although I do agree with the general consensus, which is that it was a pretty trash way to treat their collab. However, for all the hype that was around this event, I don't think Hoyo did a good enough job in blowing past my expectations, especially considering how strong their writing ability was in Amphoreus. Now, by contrast, Genshin had more events, and in my opinion, despite them not being as big as like a crossover collab, they were more interesting and better written. We had our two standing events, which is Lantern Rite and the Summer event, and Lantern Rite, despite suffering from having Hu Tao being unvoiced in the English dub, was still a strongly written story and delved more deeply into the lore of Liyue. The Summer event focused on Bennett, confirming the long-held fan theory that he was originally from Natlan, and went into more depth on why he has such bad luck, and who his parents were, and his relation to the Marjavari. Outside of his character journey, and revisiting some friends at Natlan, we also got to see Venti taking on a more active role as the Animo Archon, and we found out more about the Marjavari as a whole, which brought in lore from the Four Shades and connected it to characters we previously discussed. These events, in my opinion, had stories that went above and beyond what I expected from the events. The Summer event in Genshin is well known for hinting at future plot points in the coming patches, so it's pretty much always an anticipated event within the fandom, but I do think that this Summer event is probably my favorite so far in the Genshin story because it combined silly summer fun with more emotional and impactful storylines from Bennett, Venti, and our Natlan crew. The only Summer event that I can say I might have enjoyed just as much, or maybe a little bit more, is the Similanka event. Finally, we have an event that, in my opinion, was kind of just a fun side story, but was weirdly well written, and that's the Whirling Waltz event. From a story perspective, it was fun to get to see the Natlan characters finally leave Natlan, and it was more interesting to see Neuvillette interact with Kukuku, who is a Saurian and therefore descended from a dragon, along with Kaniche working alongside with him and Wriothesley. We also got to see Aoife and Auroron acting more like chaotic siblings, which led to some very iconic and funny, memeable moments. Despite the silliness and the general unserious vibe of the event, we did, at the end, get to see a more emotional look at Kaniche, deepening his character, which, given he's one of my favorite characters, I enjoyed immensely. Overall, though, the Whirling Waltz event, even if we take out my personal bias with Kaniche, provided a good pacing event, which showed how the world was moving along after the war in Natlan, and showcased the Natlan characters getting to leave their homeland and explore more of Teyvat. This provided breathing room between the end of Natlan and the start of Nod Krai, which was needed. So with all of this in mind, I think it's safe to say that Genshin gets the point for having the better events over the last year, even though their events may not be as big as like a big crossover event. They were solid, and they added interesting depth to the characters, and they were, overall, in my opinion, better written. Honkai Star Rail, by contrast, only had the one main story-driven event, and given the hype around it, and despite my personal opinions of the event, many in the fandom felt it fell flat, and that's why they don't get the point for this. So, in this category, Genshin gets the point for sure. Next up, we have the interlude quests. Here we're going to start with Genshin. The main interlude quest in this last year was A Time and Space for You, which saw the traveler meeting up with their Abyss sibling as the spaces and times between Notlan and the destruction of Conria overlapped, allowing us to learn more about the fall of Conria through a quest-important NPC, and with our sibling, considering how they were perceived during the time around the fall of Conria. It also sets up some interesting lore points, which would be explored more thoroughly in Nod Krai. Overall, this interlude quest did what I expected of an interlude quest. It laid the groundwork for lore that would become important in Nod Krai, and it gave us another meeting with our sibling. It was lore-heavy, but well-written, with the traveler at the forefront. Now, despite that being the main interlude quest, there was another quest, one that is kind of a prequel to Nod Krai, but I really kind of consider it an interlude quest, and this one takes place in Notlan. We are introduced to a strange newcomer, Inefa, and this newcomer supposedly has a message for us from Nod Krai, but due to her memories failing, we have to go on a quest to help her regain her sense of self in order for her to pass along the message to us. Without spoiling too much, we find out a lot more about the former Dragon Lords, which were more like AI sentient beings that ruled over Notlan in the past, as well as more important information regarding the Moon Wheel, which is Nod Krai's version of a vision. This interlude, or prequel quest, depending on how you look at it, was very well written, balanced between giving us new lore and being an emotional story for a character that we honestly had just met. This gave it a sort of conclusion to our time in Notlan and paved the way for us to go to Nod Krai. Though it's important to note that it didn't tie up all the loose ends in Notlan, it just tied them up enough to make it reasonable for the traveler to go to Nod Krai. Another important thing to note is that this story was particularly well written in the sense that we had just met Inefa, but it gave us really good reasons to care about Inefa and form kind of an emotional connection with her over the course of the story, which then, of course, makes it more reasonable for us to go to Nod Krai because we already have somebody there that we care about, on top of the message we got from Varka. Now, let's move on to Honkai Star Rail. Moving on to the Penacony interlude quest with Dahlia, to put it simply, I really don't think there were any redeeming qualities for this interlude quest. While it makes sense that to some degree that we would have returned to Penacony after Amphoreus given what happens to the planet at the end of the Trailblaze mission, this interlude quest failed in pretty much every single goal I would expect for an interlude quest to have. Now, I will admit, I have a bias here. I think Penacony was one of the worst written Trailblaze missions overall, with it being far too complicated and past the Aventurine boss fight, kinda uninteresting. Penacony had too many things going on, with too many characters who were all vying for importance in the story, which left everything feeling jumbled and convoluted, in my opinion. However, while an interlude quest maybe could have perhaps clarified some things with Penacony, or better yet, could have set us up to go to Plain Arcadia, this interlude quest did neither. In fact, it pretty much just rewrote the ending of Penacony and made it even more complicated and hard to follow, which I wasn't sure was even possible given how hard to follow the normal Trailblaze mission had been. Outside of a couple of lore drops, it did nothing to add depth to the story, and truthfully, it was so aggravating to get through that by the end of it, I was sitting there wondering what the point of anything we had just done was. It was a major disappointment, and I honestly could have simply skipped through the entire interlude quest. I probably would have done that if I hadn't been streaming it. Which is saying something, because I'm not the kind of person who skips over dialogue in any kind of story quest. Genshin gets the win here in a landslide. There's really just nothing to say about it. The 3.8 interlude quest in Honkai Star Rail was hands down the worst interlude quest I have ever played through to date in any kind of narrative game. Now, moving on from that rant, we're going to talk about the characters that were released in 2025. Now, Genshin and Honkai Star Rail actually had the same amount of new characters drop in 2025, which is a total of 17. However, where Genshin gave everyone a new free 4-star during Lantern Rite, which they always do, and Genshin overall had more 4-star characters in general release, this is because Honkai Star Rail released no new 4-star characters. And they haven't. for a really, really, really long time. Now, normally, I wouldn't say this is an issue because Honkai Star Rail, in my opinion, is a bit more free-to-play friendly, in the sense that, in general, even without purchasing in-game currency, it's fairly easy to save up enough to get at least a new character maybe every patch or every other patch. However, the real problem comes in when we consider the fact that, in general, when Honkai Star Rail introduces a new mechanic, like the Remembrance characters with memo sprites, it is almost always a necessity to get at least some of those characters, simply because the game has a sharp increase in difficulty if you don't play along with those mechanics. And as someone who does not remotely follow the meta, I struggle a lot more in Honkai Star Rail than I do in Genshin. And this is because even when Genshin introduces new mechanics to the meta, in general you can find older 4-star options that work well in a team, meaning you don't necessarily need to pick up absolutely every new 5-star that drops. This, in combo with the new 4-stars that regularly get dropped, means Genshin manages power creep way better than Honkai Star Rail. And this is good, because in my opinion, Genshin is a little less free-to-play friendly in the sense that you have to dedicate a lot of time to farming for in-game currency, which, as somebody who doesn't have a lot of time to dedicate to that, kinda sucks. In general, despite Honkai Star Rail being a little bit more free-to-play friendly in terms of in-game currency collection, and despite the fact that I personally like a lot of the character designs more in Honkai Star Rail, I do think Genshin pulls out the win here. Genshin gives a lot more options to players and rewards players with good 4-stars, even if they can't get the new 5-stars. And in this sense, I do think Genshin offers more flexibility with their new characters than Honkai Star Rail does. So while I love the Chrysosairs, ultimately, Genshin gets the point for new characters. So, we went through everything. Now we have to tally up the points, and Genshin won. I mean, Genshin just plainly won. They have way more points. Honkai Star Rail only got 1 point in 2025. Now, I know some of you are going to be in the comments and typing out and being like, oh my god, she's just glazing Genshin, blah 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 blah. Here's the thing. I like Honkai Star Rail more than I like Genshin, for reasons that I can't get into this video, because if I did, it would just be too long and it would be a rant video. However, Genshin was more solid in 2025 overall in a lot of different categories. Now, I do think that the Amphoreus patches, if you will, the story was way better than the story that we got in Genshin. I was way more excited about it, but that's just my personal opinion. And one really good story does not make you the victor of 2025, unfortunately. So let me know how you feel in the comments. Maybe you think I'm dumb and Amphoreus was shit and Genshin is objectively better in every possible way than Honkai Star Rail, and the fact that I even gave Honkai Star Rail 1 point means that I am a biased piece of shit. Or maybe you think the fact that Genshin got 3 points is wildly overstated, and you think that my hatred towards Penacony and the Interlude quest is completely unfounded and that I'm wrong and everything. And if I am, and you think so, you should comment about it, because I would like to know what other opinions are, and maybe you're going to change my mind. I mean, you won't about Penacony. Penacony is awful and terrible, and I'm never going to change my mind about that. But you might change my mind about other things. So feel free to comment about it down below. I'm also going to try to put a poll up, because apparently I can do that in these videos. I don't really know how that works, but we're going to give it a go. So, with all of this being said, let me tell you kind of about how content's going to be moving forward. I have 2 games, or not games, but 2 videos that are going to be coming out semi-soon, hopefully, if my video editing goes well, that have nothing to do with Genshin or Honkai Star Rail. However, I am also working on some Genshin and Honkai Star Rail videos kind of in the background, and those should be coming out fairly soon. My hope is that they'll come out kind of in the next few weeks or next month or so. So if you want more content like this, or you're interested in the new content that I'm going to be posting, you should like this video, you should share it with your friends, and you should subscribe, because the algorithm, I need it to like me, otherwise it's just gonna kind of let my videos sit there and cry and, you know, die on the floor, which, you know, I put a lot of work into these, and so I don't really want that to happen. So, do all of the things, and with all of this being said, may the wind bless your travels, and may your journey take you Starward.